Well, it's now time to bring you the part one of our interview segment. Now, the level of frustration of Nigerians over worsening power supply problems lately is better imagined than experienced, following in particular the collapse of the national grid twice this month, coupled with the constraints of procuring gas to run some power plants. The situation has also adversely impacted industrial productivity and worsened unemployment as the cost of production now escalates, causing manufacturers to struggle to make a profit margin due to the rising cost of diesel as well in the past few weeks. Now, to this end, the federal government has also announced the implementation of the Siemens Public-Private Initiative, with funding arrangements amounting to about $4 billion as a means to boost power transmission capacity and other power infrastructure in the country, which would also lead to improved power supply to the average Nigerians. Well, to discuss this and much more, looking at issues concerning electricity supply in the country, I have joining me virtually former chairman of the National Electricity Regulatory Commission, Sam Ahmadi. Thank you very much for joining us on the show today, Mr. Ahmadi. Now, let's start off our conversation looking at your analysis of the power sector within this first quarter. We are wrapping up the last day of the month of March, and it has been quite a volatile season we've seen in the energy market globally. But locally, we've had issues around grid collapse and calls for reforms within our power sector, looking at the fact that we've privatized the sector, and yet not much is left to be said.
This probably one of the worst quarters years, especially last. This one has ended with very acute outages, poor service contracts with collapse, like I said. But again, they are not unusual in the history in the past 5 years. So, quite frequent, high frequency. This collapse, maybe not total collapse, partial collapse, but they all speak to one thing, speak to the fragility, the almost near collapse of the grid, financing, and the failure of some of the policies to bear fruits as expected. So we are back to, we are maybe a stimulus plan. We want to see more attention. We want to see whether it can help to improve the distribution capacity. But again, last collapse, speak more to gas and generation, always of course generators are also much money. But behind it is lack of creative what the gas suppliers will understand are no longer willing to give gas to generators because they're not being paid, and they're not being paid because generators are not getting them up to that. Total is not getting enough remittances from the distribution company. So primarily, this is like perfect storm of all the fragilities and inefficiencies, and basically just tells us that as part of the last this episode has not succeeded in maybe overcoming some of these inefficiencies and retooling the sector in a way that we're going to have significant reliability and significant improvement. So this is where we are. We are back to a hard place, telling us that the plans have not worked well, or maybe worked at all.
I like acknowledgement that this is one of the toughest days that we've had to face, and then it's time to rethink, retool and re-strategize, especially within the area of investment within our power infrastructure. Now, in terms of the bottlenecks we have from transmission, generation and distribution as well, how do you see things taking shape following all of the conversations and meetings we've had in the last few days and months starting this year?
Yeah, what I think is, again, you need an influx of financing. And so the Siemens plan would help with improving transmission capability. So primarily, equipment are involved, some level of change management will involved. So depending also on policy alignment, there have been some talk around privatizing, commercializing, or even regionalizing the grid. So these are very radical policy changes that I don't see the government carrying on in a year or so to end of government. The election year, the usual response is to avoid major changes. So we're going to see maybe some improvement in transmission arising from the use of these equipments and investment of chief administrators from Siemens plant. At the distribution level, we're going to see more change because look, they talk about tariffs. Tariffs have gone up significantly in the last 1 year. But again, the losses are still high. Discos are not able to access funding enough to improve their network and be able to take in more power. And they're not able also to increase their remittance to the market. And therefore, we may not be too sure whether generators will have enough gas to fire the plants. So I don't expect much improvement in a significant, sustainable manner. What we can see is maybe some patchwork towards the second quarter, and we not have this level of big collapse, maybe not. But again, look at the political economy, look at the market, the depth of this market. If you look at the fiscal crunch the government is facing, it looks like there are just not many places where they can get so much money to feed into the system. And we shouldn't expect improvement both in remittances, in customer payment, and of course in investment by disco owners in a short period. So I don't expect a large significant change. I expect some improvement, and maybe we will manage well not to fall into this level of data.
But Mr. Ahmadi, I'd like to question your optimism of this deal we have with Siemens Power, this Siemens Power deal, because when we're looking at the immediate rise in electricity generation, this is looking at about 2,000 megawatts. The timeline there is 18 months. That's about a year and a half away from the current timeline we are on right now. And it's also looking at ensuring that we have about 40 million Nigerians receive much more reliable power supply within the phase one of this presidential power initiative. But do you think this is enough of a magic wand to correct this old narrative that we don't have things working, and in the short term there's almost no respite?
Well, like you said, it's too small. I mean, too little. I don't expect, it's not a magic wand at all. By the way, don't forget, there are going to be logistic issues with implementation. On paper, we're going to have focus on covering 2,000 megawatts. But then, in reality, you need to run the program on as planned or scheduled, have the manpower, investment on time, and the capacity to optimize. So I think, like I said, we're going to see some workaround that will enable the system perhaps not shut down the way it did. But I don't think both the Siemens plan or any other plan I've seen is enough to fill the gap in terms of financing, in terms of managerial competence, and in terms of change management. We are not going to see in the short term any dramatic change. We're going to see, with the hydros picking up in the rainy season, which is more generation, more dependent on gas. Maybe the operator and the regulator will raise the meters level and see once more money from the discos to pay for gas, and we'll see reluctant gas suppliers putting more gas grid. But primarily, there's no plan that tells me that in the medium to long term, or even in the short term, there will be significant change. We will see some workaround that will probably optimize a few days and then save us from kind of collapse we had the last 2 weeks. But save that, I don't see much. There's no magic one here.
Okay, now let's also talk a little bit about the debt base that we have along the value chain as well, which you've also attributed to. We've heard from the power gencos talking about this low electricity generation due to the 1.64 trillion naira owed them by the Nigerian Bulk Electricity Trading PLC. We've also had complaints from the discos as well, and then a whole lot more. Now, how do you see this also informing the sort of shape-up we'll see in terms of our creation of on-grid and off-grid power solutions? Because now this is opening up the conversation to think bigger than the ordinary business model we are following right now.
I think clearly what this means is that, look, these debts are not going to be amortized soon. We're not, like I said, expecting so much increase in remittances and receivables in this market for the short to medium term. So what's going to happen is that, look, the businesses are going to be looking for off-grid solution. Already, many of the big commercial concerns are maybe almost on off-grid, on self-provisioning. And so what you see is increase in cost of business, clearly providing for yourself, self-provision, except for large-scale specialists to be very cost inefficient. So what that means is that we're going to see increase in especially pressure. If the grid becomes thoroughly unreliable and more businesses migrate to self-provision with the expected increase in cost of doing business, then we're going to see greater especially pressure. We're going to see, of course, that maybe the discos may need to even charge the domestic or non-business consumers like us, families and individuals more, because we take out, if these big businesses go out more on their own, then it further increases the cost of energy for captive consumers like families and homes. So it's really bad. It's double warning. The businesses will incur more costs and their prices will go up. Their goods will sell more, services will be more expensive. Again, individual households and individual consumers may be faced with more time to capture these increasing losses, which the regulator will be forced to make good on them. And so we're going to see maybe increase in tariffs and less improvement in quality of service because of all these low receivables, low remittance, increasing cost of input like fuel, gas, and all that. And then, of course, the lack of capacity to really reduce the unit cost of this sector.
Mr. Ahmadi, are you surprised by the silence we've heard in terms of metering? The overwhelming noise within the power sector has just been this whole issue around the grid collapse. Now, some way, somehow, we'll still later experience some upward adjustment in terms of tariff pricing. The call is to see cost-reflective tariffs. By the end of the day, do you think we are taking seriously as much as possible the issue around metering and how this also would help in terms of our on-grid and off-grid power solutions and also meeting our demand and knowing what quota is really needed?
I don't think we're taking metering the way we should. I mean, metering is critical, not just for consumers to conserve consumption, but as well, and of course, reduce their volumetric impact of increasing tariff. But of course, also help the discos, avoid losses. But again, look, they need to roll out meter, they need to finance it. The federal government meter plans, I don't know how well and how well capacity is and how it's been deployed. But the problem is that we're seeing less meter rollout. And with this crisis now, all attention shifts towards how to save the discos from collapse, how to make sure that Telcos are able to pay gas suppliers and increase quantity. So very little attention is paid both from regulator or policy or military. We're going to see, and that's the danger of this crisis. Commuter customers will bear the brunt of all. Tariffs are increasing, they have no way to first control their consumption, they can't conserve their consumption, and again they are exposed to unregulated and measured tariffs and pricing. So in the short to medium term again, we will see much movement in metering. Metering that discos ought to make themselves are also influenced by their financial state and of course the level of regulatory enforcement. And then again, the government meter rollout doesn't seem like much is happening at that level. So my view will be that on-meter customers will suffer more in this market as we expect price to go up and quality of service to go up.
Okay, now, lastly, wrapping up our conversation, Mr. Sam Ahmadi, let's also look at the task ahead for the Minister of Power in the coming days. Now, one of his responses to the crisis we have on hand is that it says that the issue has now been restored to full operation, talking about the grid collapse. Do you think that we have the public buy-in into the word of government and ensuring that we have all these issues under control, because the reality remains that the volume of power supply cannot be compared to the previous volume prior to the grid collapse? So do you think the word of the minister holds any water as we are continuing to build some level of public trust?
Well, I think the minister is trapped. He has to speak politically. Yes, his grid is restored. But again, the crisis led to the grid, which is low power supply for the generators, Of course, transmission service network being poor has all been solved. So yes, we've got respite. We are back. The grid is back, but then the quantity supply is still poor, and consumers are still having scarcity. And many parts of the country, maybe in my own part of the country, we are having scheduling. So maybe the morning homes, the homes don't get power, places get power in the evening. So this is what we're going to do. Rationing going on right now, especially in the Abuja area. The minister is trapped, has little options, and my general view is that the quality of leadership in this sector is very poor. We need a much more improved leadership level to be able to deal with really truthfully difficult situations where the figures are not adding up, where the generators themselves are now not able to generate as they ought to generate, or at least as they have the capacity. And they haven't disclosed themselves as almost like backup. So difficult time requires high energy leadership, but I don't think we're getting that at this point. So the minister is just basically trying to say the best he can. We are back, but we are not better.
Thank you so much for your time on the show today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, Mr. Sam Ahmadi.
Thank you.